The election process in America. A close look at our most important right as citizens, the right to vote. In our program, we have three subject matter experts. From Princeton University, Princeton, New Jersey, Robert George, the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence.
The American system of voting was based on practices that had been in place in the states and localities of what became the United States prior to the Revolutionary War and to the establishment of the new Republican government on the soil of North America.
From the United States Naval Academy, Annapolis, Maryland, Priscilla Zadi, Associate Professor of Political Science.
The framers wanted a representative form of government. The idea, Madison called this a Republican form of government. The idea was that voters would elect those to represent them and filter the passions of the public into public policy.
From UCLA, Los Angeles, California, Exandra Caden, former president, Los Angeles chapter of the League of Women Voters.
We're almost a unique organization in America today. We are nonpartisan. We don't support either party. We don't support candidates. But our goal is to create an educated and informed electorate and to encourage participation.
In our program, we'll review the election process throughout the history of our nation. We'll discover the right to vote as one of our most important rights. We'll learn about the Electoral College and how we actually elect our chief executives. We'll also look at the state and local levels of government and some of their unique features. We'll review the constitutional amendments which gradually gave more and more citizens the right to vote. And we'll explore ways in which the election process might be improved and how you can become involved in your government. First, some words related to the election process that may be new to you. Franchise or enfranchise. A franchise, when speaking of voting, means having the right to vote.
Another word for the vote is the franchise. The word franchise has other applications as well. We think of chain stores as franchises, McDonald's is a franchise, Burger King is a franchise, but franchise is also a word for voting.
Disfranchise or disfranchisement means the opposite, having your voting rights taken away or denied.
Sometimes, probably more often than not these days, we use a slightly different term, which is technically incorrect. We say disenfranchisement. We say disenfranchisement, although properly the term is disfranchisement.
Suffrage. This is another way of saying franchise.
The term suffrage is a term that means the right to vote.
Lobby and lobbyist. A lobbyist works to persuade elected officials to support a specific cause or special interest group.
Actually, the term comes from people who hung around the lobbies of legislatures and could buttonhole legislators to convince them of something or other.
Along the same lines as lobby is the PAC, Political Action Committee.
A political action committee is actually something that's now ingrained in our law. It's a committee created and registered with state and federal government to advance the interests of either candidates or issues.
The Political Action Committee's primary reason for being is to raise money to influence legislation favored by special interest groups. Another term we should explain.
Nationally special interests tend to be those that have grassroots organizations where they can turn out their supporters at a local congressional election, so that teachers, realtors, contractors, the National Rifle Association, the AMA, the American Medical Association, they have troops that they can turn out to contribute money to candidates or vote for them. And they tend to be the most powerful, not because of the money alone, but because of the votes.
The Electoral College. It's not a school. It's a name given to a group of people, party loyalists chosen to elect the president and vice president. As a group, they're called a slate of electors. Each party has the same number. More populous states have more electors than less populous states.
On the ballot, it will say the name of the candidate for president and vice president. What you're really doing is electing a slate of electors. The electors are selected by the states. Most of them are party loyalists, and their job is to go to their state capitals in December and vote for that slate.
The Electoral College is the Constitution's method for electing the President and Vice President of the United States. Although we are a democracy, we are not a direct democracy. We're a representative democracy.
We'll talk more about the Electoral College as we explore the election process in America. A poll is a survey or tally of votes. A polling place is where we vote. Usually, public places like schools and fire stations are used on Election Day as a polling place. A ballot is simply the voting instrument. For example, a card you punch or mark to show your choice when you vote. The ballots are marked in secret and then dropped into the ballot box. Counting is done by machine. If a recount is demanded in a close election, a hand count may be required. Of course, today, with computers being a way of life, voting more and more will become an electronic process. An absentee ballot is used by people in the military and others who can't get to the polling place on Election Day. These are sent out to registered voters in advance, completed and returned by mail. Each voter's signature is compared to the registrar's database of signatures. This then authenticates the absentee ballot. Many would claim that the right to vote is our most important right. It certainly is not something to be taken lightly. Not everyone in America has the right to vote. Non-citizens are considered pledged to some other country and do not have the right to vote. Those who have committed serious crimes, felonies, have forfeited their right to vote. And the legally insane are not permitted to vote. And yet, many of those who do have the right to vote don't.
When you consider millions of people are voting, my vote just doesn't count.
Yeah, when you don't vote, you also don't have the opportunity to, really don't have the right to complain.
I don't bother to vote. I don't think my one little vote matters.
But there are lots of reasons why we think why people don't vote. And one of them is that they don't feel it'll matter. Another is that they may think that the choices are irrelevant to them, either because the candidates don't mean anything to them or the issues are not relevant.
The ballot measures are too confusing, and I don't have time to research them all.
They're not dissatisfied. They're not angry. They just think that the voting is not as important to them.
Typically, only about half the eligible voters actually vote. Even in presidential elections and when critical, controversial issues are at stake, many Americans fail to vote. When we do that, we give away our voice in our government. We let others run it for us.
My last book was called Surviving Power, and it's about what happens to people who lose power and the experience of power. And I was mostly talking to people in the public sector, but later I was doing research in the private sector. And everyone who had been in power said what they missed most was the feeling of significance, that what they did mattered. And I think the same is true of voters. If they felt that what they did mattered, they would vote. They would feel significant. You feel like it really made a difference.
A question on the test given to immigrants applying for citizenship asks, what is our most important right? The answer is the right to vote. Former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, would agree.
When Earl Warren left the Supreme Court in 1969, he had shepherded the court through Brown versus Board of Education, through Miranda, and a number of other famous rulings. When he was asked what was the most important decision of his tenure, to the surprise of some, his argument was Baker versus Carr, a 1962 decision arguing one man, one vote. And Warren's argument was that giving people the right at the ballot secured their right to keep other rights free for themselves, but that their voice at the ballot was so critical to other rights that followed beyond that.
Of our civil rights or our civic rights, it does seem to me that the right to vote really is the central right. It's the right on which everything else depends. The rest of our civic rights would very much be in jeopardy if we lost or gave up or abandoned the right to vote.
The importance of the right to vote is evidenced by the fact that a majority of the Constitution's 26 amendments relate in some way to elections and voting. But while voting is an important right, we should also consider it an important responsibility.
In the United States, we consider that a good citizen has a moral obligation to vote and to participate in civic affairs. We consider that an obligation of citizenship, though unlike, for example, Australia, where it's required, we don't impose voting as a legal obligation on our citizens.
In many elections through the years, the winner was elected by a very slim margin. Take, for example, the presidential race between Thomas Dewey and Harry Truman back in 1948. The race was so close, the Chicago Tribune guessed the outcome wrong and declared Dewey the winner. In the 1960 Nixon-Kennedy race, John F. Kennedy won by only 119,450 votes, with 68.8 million votes cast. What if those 120,000 people had said,
I don't bother to vote. I don't think my one little vote matters.
Here in Los Angeles, we've had any number of elections decided in the last year with fewer than 100 votes.
when our country was young, almost all eligible voters did vote. But they didn't vote along party lines as many people do today. There were political factions, of course, but the two-party system, as we know it, didn't emerge until the 1800s. The Founding Fathers actually considered the idea of political parties repulsive. George Washington, Ben Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and other founders of our country were men of the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. It was a time when intelligent men felt they could find answers to public matters through a close examination of the facts. Yes, times have changed, and so has the typical voter. In the earliest years of our republic, most voters were white males, landowners. Many were farmers.
The typical voter in the early days of the Republic, and really prior to the creation of the American Republic in what would become the United States, was a landowner. They wanted the voter to be someone who had a stake in the common success of the American project. They wanted the voter to be somebody who had property, who was stable, who had an interest in how decisions were made and in the outcome of the decisions. They wanted a voter who had a stake in the future.
Participating in the election process begins on the state and local levels. Before we can vote, we must register to vote. That means adding your name to the list of people in your community who are qualified to vote. It's a means of proving you are who you say you are and eliminating voting fraud.
It used to be that anyone could turn up at the poll and vote, and there was a tradition in America of voting early and often. Here in Los Angeles, they used to corral people, men of course, since women didn't have the right to vote, get them drunk the night before, and then in the day of the election, just literally take them out of the corral, bring them to the poll, let them vote, and go back.
Registering to vote is a simple matter. The League of Women Voters has always played a big part in making sure all eligible voters are registered for general elections, which come every 2 years.
No, elections at the local level are held at the same frequency as elections at the state and national level. They're usually held at the off year, though. They're not held at the same time. So every 2 years, in the even-numbered years, we have a federal election. Local elections are usually in the odd-numbered years, and that gives the opportunity for those candidates to get airtime, to get some visibility. But the truth of the matter is that it's very hard for candidates to become known at the local level these days.
This is one of the big differences between national, statewide, and local elections. On the local level, we rarely get to know the candidates and what they represent.
At the presidential level, we get to learn a lot about them. At the gubernatorial and the Senate, where you're talking about a statewide election, you get to know more about them. But the lower you go on the electoral ladder, the less you know about the candidates. And that's where party cues become important. Without a party, how do you make your choice if you know nothing about the candidates? Usually, for instance, when judges are on the ballot, nobody knows who the judges are. So you make your choice based on gender or ethnicity. Well, maybe that tells you something about how that person is going to behave in office, but maybe it doesn't.
Often in local elections, the most you hear from the candidates is a sign in someone's yard.
And what the sign tells you is that that family, that householder, supports that candidate. Now that tells you something if you know that householder, or you know that block. You know, your neighbors support this person, so that's probably someone you should support. And that's actually the way most people make up their minds who to vote for.
Local governments take different forms. Some communities have a mayor, some don't. Some are governed by a city council, and the council may elect one of the members to serve as mayor. Sometimes they all serve terms as mayor on a rotating basis. A recent innovation is the city manager, a professional administrator, not elected by the citizens, but hired by the city to run the community's affairs.
They were subject to a board, but the professional made the decisions on a day-to-day basis and sort of administered city government. Mayors are more a product of larger communities where you have the same kind of structure you have at the state and the federal level. It's up to the state to decide what form of government each community might have, and the community may choose it, but the state government usually says you can have Form A, Form B, or Form C. Or there are charter cities which have a little bit more independence of the state, but that's also determined by state law.
State governments, for the most part, are structured like the federal government.
State governments are very much like the national government in their structure, some more so than others. Most of them don't have very professional legislatures. The legislature is not in session year-round. It may be part-time. Legislators may hold other jobs.
And that's the big difference. Local and state officials tend not to be career politicians, and Americans like that.
Americans tend to like amateurs in politics. I don't know why, but we are afraid of professionals. We don't like career politicians, although you wouldn't take that same attitude toward a doctor or any other professional that you go to. There's a certain amount of expertise in public policy issues, in knowing the rules of legislative government.
Local and statewide elections have come to be an important forum for a direct form of democracy associated with the progressive era, the ballot measure. On the surface, it would appear it's a method for the people to take a direct hand in government. But the ballot measure is not without problems.
The problem with ballot measures as a way of making law is that the voter only gets a yes or a no. And most legislation, public policy, tends to be, or should be, I think, the result of consensus and compromise and engaging all parties in an issue and reaching some agreement about what the legislation ought to be, what the public policy ought to be.
More and more, ballot measures put on the ballot by special interest groups succeed or fail based on how much money is spent to promote them or defeat them. Often when passed, their constitutionality is challenged.
And so what happens is you pass a ballot measure, then there's a suit filed. And years go by before there's any resolution. So the frustration that led people to put the measure on the ballot in the first place is really never resolved.
What's more, ballot measures are sometimes confusing and misleading.
There was an initiative a couple of years ago, and I don't remember what it was, but it was extremely misleading. You couldn't tell by the name of the initiative whether you were voting for or against something. And the same thing happens in terms of the people and the organizations that are listed as supporting an initiative, typically Citizens for Good Government or Citizens for Freedom. It doesn't tell you anything. And it takes an awful lot of money to counter something when there's a particular constituency that's got the money or the resources to advertise something. It's a very strange way to make law, it seems to me.
We think of the right to vote as coming late for blacks, and still later in our country's history for women. But surprisingly, at the very beginning, in various regions of the 13 colonies, one could find women and free blacks voting.
When it came to voting, there was a great deal of variation in the colonies and then in the states after the establishment of the new republic in the early days. In some jurisdictions, women were permitted to vote. In other jurisdictions, they weren't permitted to vote. There were some jurisdictions in which free blacks were voters. Of course, anywhere where blacks were enslaved, they were not voters.
But the right to vote for women was taken away. They were disfranchised, and black male slaves never had the right to vote until after the Civil War.
Take, for example, the state of New Jersey. Women in New Jersey were voters in the early days, in the colonial period and in the early days of the Republic. But then that right was taken away by law in the early 19th century, and it wasn't restored until the women's suffrage movement emerged in the middle, really, of the 19th century.
The inequality that existed in our nation's past may seem very unfair, but it must be looked at in the perspective of history.
Again, it's important to understand this in historical context. There was considered to be a division of labor, and public responsibilities were, for the most part, understood to be male responsibilities. Domestic responsibilities were, in large part, considered to be female responsibilities. Often in the home, women exercised a very significant degree of authority. They made decisions that were theirs to make for the family that men were understood not to have the authority to make. And in the public sphere, the situation was reversed, where primary authority for making families' decisions about political matters, for example, were in the hands of men. Now, of course, eventually, we came to have a different understanding of that. But I think it would be a mistake to simply look at the franchise to notice that there were times when free black men were voters and women weren't, and to conclude from that that somehow our law and social policy favored black men over women.
In the beginning, when America was only 13 colonies, national elections and the Electoral College process worked a little differently from the way it does today. Each state had the same number of electors as it had senators and members of the House of Representatives. This remains true today. But in the early days of our country, each state's electors cast their vote for both a president and a vice president. The vice president had to be from a different state than the president's home state. In the case of a tie, or if no candidate received a majority of the votes, the House of Representatives would decide.
Under the Constitution, as originally framed before it was amended, the president and vice president were chosen on a common ballot. In other words, the person who got the largest number of votes in the Electoral College became president, and the runner-up became vice president.
In the election of 1800, what happens is that the Electoral College goes to vote, and the two top vote getters tie. So the election goes into the House.
Eventually, 3 members of the Federalist Party in the House of Representatives broke ranks with their party, switched their vote from Burr to Jefferson, and Jefferson was elected our 3rd president.
After the problem in the election between Burr and Jefferson, sentiment arose in the country to make sure that such a thing wouldn't happen again.
So the Constitution was amended. This was the 12th Amendment, to elect the vice president and the president on separate ballots. So no longer would the runner-up be the vice president. There would be an independent ballot for the vice president.
In the 19th century, the two-party system emerged.
The formal first party was created by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison whilst on a canoe trip up the Hudson. And it was originally called the Republican and Democratic Party. It's now the Democratic Party, and it's the oldest continuing party in the world, actually. The opposition to the Republican Democratic Party were the Federalists, who became the Whigs, who became the Republicans.
After the election of Andrew Jackson as president in 1828, the two-party system became crystallized. Jackson was the first president to run under the banner of the newly formed Democratic Party. At the same time, public opinion became more important in presidential elections, and party conventions were held starting in 1831. The franchise, as we said earlier, means the right to vote. From the beginning, many were denied the right to vote. They were disfranchised. Following the Civil War, things began to change. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the so-called Civil War Amendments, expanded many freedoms.
First, in the 13th, to abolish slavery, and then in the 14th, to secure the basic civil rights of the recently freed former slaves against the various forms of discrimination that the Republicans in Congress knew would be imposed upon blacks once the southern states were readmitted to the Union.
The 15th makes it clear that race cannot be used as a condition for voting, cannot be used as a qualification.
The rights extended by the 14th Amendment are important and apply to all citizens.
The 14th Amendment held that no one could be denied, no citizen could be denied the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, nor could any person be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor could any person be deprived of the equal protection of the laws.
But it stopped short of granting the right to vote.
It does not give voting rights, and it stops short of that. When you look at equal protection and due process, it stops short of voting rights, which later comes about in the 15th Amendment. The language of Section 2 that really causes the ire is the mention of black males, of only men. And it's women that felt betrayed by that. Many women that originally fought for the rights of women to be able to vote felt betrayed by the language in the 14th Amendment. They had worked with abolitionists, they had worked for equality for blacks, and then here in the language of the 14th Amendment, they're left out.
Expanded rights for women had to wait a while longer, but the 15th Amendment had extended the right to vote to black men. Nevertheless, blacks still had problems voting. The southern states were not ready to accept this new privileged status for blacks.
Of course, the southern states still found some ways, some sneaky, tricky ways, literacy tests, poll taxes, and so forth, to discriminate and deny people civil rights.
Things such as grandfather clauses and white primaries and literacy tests and poll tax were all used at the state level to attempt to keep blacks from voting.
The so-called white primary needs an explanation. First of all, what is a primary election?
The primary is the way the party now chooses its candidate. Many states in the country have open primaries, so people from any party or someone who doesn't belong to a party can come and cast a vote. But generally speaking, it's for the purpose of the party choosing its candidate.
Now, regarding the white primary, in various regions of the country where one political party dominates year after year, the real selection for public office is who that party chooses as their candidate in the primary election. Using her home state of Texas as an example, Professor Zadi explains.
For example, the state of Texas was famous for having an all-white primary. Texas was heavily Democratic, and the real selection for the position involved was at the primary level. So that instead of saying, well, our general election, we do allow blacks to vote, they weren't allowed to vote in the primary system, where the real selection took place. Typically, the Democratic candidate at the general election would be unopposed, or the candidate running against them would be someone with little clout, so that the real action was at the primary level.
Tricks like white primaries and poll taxes were effective in disfranchising black voters, even though the 14th Amendment made it clear these things were unconstitutional.
Poll taxes were oftentimes levied at very inopportune time for blacks particularly, right before Christmas, for example, to force them into a set of choices, whether to pay to vote or buy gifts for their family.
A subsequent constitutional amendment, the 24th, outlawed poll taxes in all states.
In the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, which by almost all accounts went very badly, when Lincoln died, I think what died with him was any real chance for a peaceful reintegration and fair reintegration of the states of the old Confederacy into the Union.
These practices continued, died out over the years. For example, by 1944, the all-white primary is gone. But it takes a while for these practices to start to fall by the wayside. Really, it was not until 1965, to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that the right to vote becomes very secure for Black Americans.
Race relations really have never recovered from the conflict over slavery and then Reconstruction. I think we as Americans have to hold out a hope that the day will come when we will stop looking at each other as members of one race or another and start understanding each other as fellow citizens and more fundamentally fellow human beings, common brothers under the fatherhood of God, to use Martin Luther King's great image. But that day hasn't come yet. We still live with the horrible legacy of slavery and segregation. And I think that sometimes race is appealed to really by both sides in the current ideological divide in a way that simply perpetuates the hard feeling and the animosity that is part of this terrible, terrible legacy.
Another discrepancy with our election process was discovered toward the end of the 19th century, about 1890. This had to do with the way in which we elect our United States senators.
Under the original Constitution, senators from each state were not elected by popular vote in the states, but rather were elected or appointed by the state legislatures of the individual states.
But a problem comes about 1890, when a number of state legislatures are very corrupt, and the legislatures are controlled by party bosses, controlled by corporate wealth, to elect the legislatures of the state, and then, of course, to carry that further into the United States Senate.
That changed in 1913. The 17th Amendment provided for the direct election of senators. So this brought the Senate into line with the House of Representatives. Both the Senate and the House would be decided upon by the people of each individual state.
These changes to our Constitution led to more political change, a change for the better, labeled as progressivism.
The progressive movement in general tried to move power away from political elites, bosses, political parties, and so forth, and shift power in the direction of the people themselves.
This led to still another political change, a move toward federalism. But this does not mean a national government that dominates the states. It means, in fact, the opposite.
Federalism protects the authority, the autonomy of the states. It ensures that our states are not mere subdivisions of the national government, but have an independent autonomy and authority, and our national government is a government of limited powers, a limited government. That's what federalism is.
The movement of women's suffrage begins to gain steam in the latter part of the 19th century and was tied into other issues.
Not only did leaders of women seek the right to vote, but they sought to be free from other civil disabilities where civil disabilities were in place when it came to things such as property ownership and the right to bring lawsuits in their own name and in their own right and so forth. But the linchpin of the women's movement of those days really was the issue of voting.
In 1875, in a case called Minor versus Haberstadt, the court argued a case involving a woman named Virginia Minor, who wants to vote and argues under the privileges and immunities of the 14th Amendment, she should have the right to vote. The court's ruling there was the qualifications to vote were set by the state and not by the national government, and that if the state did not want to give women the right to vote, they didn't have to.
Some of the most prominent leaders of the women's suffrage movement were also leaders in other areas. For example, Susan B. Anthony, a Quaker lady, a single woman, an activist on behalf of many women's causes, was also involved in the abolition movement to abolish slavery, also involved in the temperance movement to fight alcoholism, and also, interestingly, involved in the movement against abortion, trying to strengthen by legislation common law prohibitions and restrictions on abortion.
Susan B. Anthony, her likeness now emblazoned on the $1 coin, was the most notable figure of women's suffrage, although there were others, like Lucy Stone and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Out of the women's suffrage movement, a new generation of female leaders grew, like Carrie Chapman Catt, who founded the League of Women Voters.
Carrie Chapman Catt formed the League of the women who had been fighting for suffrage and made the point that we had the right to vote. There were 20 million women in the country. We needed to be educated to make the right choice.
Gaining the franchise for women finally succeeded. With the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, women at last had the right in all states to vote, but it passed by a slim margin.
When the vote comes to the fore, the House votes for it, the Senate does not. The United States Senate has to come back in a special session and votes for it, and despite the fact that no Southern state supported it, the 19th Amendment's adopted in 1920.
That's right. No Southern states voted in favor.
No Southern state, not one. All of them rejected it. Yeah.
The most recent Voting Rights Amendment, the 26th Amendment, expanded the franchise to include 18-year-olds. The reasoning being, if 18-year-olds can fight and die for their country in the military, they can also vote.
In the 1960s, we had a very controversial war, the war in Vietnam. And for that war, we were drafting young men at age 18. So in the context of the dispute over the Vietnam War, many people began to think that it was unfair to draft young men to fight and possibly to die when they didn't have the opportunity to vote. They couldn't participate in the decision whether to conduct the war, whether to have a military draft, but nevertheless they were sent away as a result of these decisions to fight and possibly die.
The Electoral College is an important element in the election process. Many Americans misunderstand it, so let's take a closer look. It's the means by which we elect our president and vice president.
The Constitution itself calls for the Electoral College. We've never had the direct election of the president and the vice president in the United States.
The Electoral College has a winner-take-all system, or a unit rule, in which the winner of the popular vote, even by one, gets all of a state's electoral votes. And the number of electoral votes set by a state is the size of their congressional delegation, their House members plus their Senate members.
The original theory of the Constitution when it came to electing the president and vice president of the United States was that these are matters that shouldn't be left to the public at large, so the electors in the Electoral College, it was hoped, would be a kind of natural aristocracy, a sort of aristocracy of political good sense and political virtue, who could be trusted really to elect the best people as president and vice president.
After the popular vote is cast in November, the Electoral College members go to their state house in December and cast their votes. Naturally, we expect the vote of the Electoral College to reflect the choice of the American people in the popular election. But there were a few times in history that it didn't work that way.
4 times in history, the winner of the popular vote did not win the most Electoral College votes. That's happened in 1824. 1876, 1888, and in the year 2000.
In the year 2000, Al Gore received the most popular votes, but George W. Bush received more electoral votes, but by a very slim margin.
I think the Electoral College made a great deal of difference in the election of 2000. Had we not had an Electoral College system, we could have seen a recount of the entire nation, which I cannot even imagine what that would have happened. The Electoral College contained the brush fire to just the state of Florida. Because of the winner-take-all system, other states were not considered up for a review.
It is a benefit that Americans are reminded that votes count, that any individual vote can count, that elections can in fact sometimes be very close. So we shouldn't consider that voting is something that's really not important because our vote really doesn't count. Well, Florida proves that our votes do count.
I think that people would vote if they thought their vote mattered, but it's easy in a large society to think that it doesn't matter, that someone else will take care of it. And that's maybe the underside of our last election debacle, was that we came to see that votes do matter, and they matter a great deal.
Most people were affected that way. Most people were also impressed with the need for ballot reform.
I think most Americans were appalled at the idea that our selection of president was going to come down to individuals with magnifying glasses holding paper ballots up to the light to determine the amount of punch through a hole. I think you will see reform. You'll probably see states going to an easier version of voting, perhaps something electronic.
I'm sure it'll come, and when you talk to younger voters, people who grew up, or younger people who grew up with computers, they can't understand why we don't go to it. There's a fear right now about the potential of voter fraud.
The actual physical way of voting in Florida is inadequate and archaic. It's behind the times. We have better technologies than the one that was used in Florida. I think the punch card system is an antique that should be relegated to the museums. There are clearer, more efficient ways of voting that don't create the problems of dimpled chads and pregnant chads that you have with the punch card system.
What's growing today is the use of mail-in ballots. And in fact, the state of Oregon doesn't hold elections at a poll anymore. They just mail out the ballot and people send it back in.
The other noteworthy aspect of the Bush-Gore election was the involvement of the courts.
I think if you would ask most scholars of the Constitution and of the court system whether the Supreme Court of the United States would have taken that case, most of them would have said no. I think it was a surprise to almost everyone that they did enter into the debate of the election.
I think it would be a mistake, though, to jump to the conclusion that since there was a problem in Florida this time, we need to radically change our entire electoral system. I think it's a mistake to assume, on the basis of what happened in Florida, that we've got a fundamentally flawed national electoral system. We don't.
I think the amazing thing of the election of 2000 isn't who got involved, but how it ended, in that it ended peacefully.
While I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College. And tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession.
Well, Al Gore's concession speech made it very clear that the final word had been written, that the winner had won, and he in fact used the words, "I concede." He made it very clear to anyone that would even consider resisting that George Bush was the legitimate winner, the legitimate president of the United States. And I think in our system, that's really something not to be taken too lightly, that we transfer power every 4 years in such a peaceful way. There's no tanks On Pennsylvania Avenue, there is no use of the military, and very calmly, very smoothly, there is transition.
I also accept my responsibility, which I will discharge unconditionally, to honor the new president-elect and do everything possible to help him bring Americans together in fulfillment of the great vision that our Declaration of Independence defines and that our Constitution affirms and defends.
Exercising your right to vote is just one way you can do your part as a good citizen. Here are some other ways you can get involved.
You can participate in politics both passively and actively. Just being an informed consumer of political information is, I think, a civic duty, that you understand the issues and understand the effects of those issues upon you and other Americans and even the world.
Of course, one of the ways that Americans become involved in politics is by running for public office. And all voting age citizens who haven't forfeited their rights by committing a felony or something like that are eligible to hold public office. And it would be very good if more people were willing to seek public office.
I think you can get involved in issues through lobbying, through participation, through attending a rally, through working for candidates, working in a campaign.
Write letters to the editor, carry on debates in newspapers, over the internet. Help to inform fellow citizens of issues that one knows about, and stay informed. Be a reader. Be someone who's involved in political discussions.
So there's a host of things you can do beyond running for office yourself.
The vote, we should remember, the franchise, was won with difficulty. Democracy hasn't obtained in all places at all times. It cost blood and treasure of our ancestors to gain for us the right to vote. So people should take that right very seriously.
Our democracy, our way of life, has not been won easily. On many occasions, we've had to fight and die to maintain it. It's through our election process and each of us exercising our precious right to vote that we can witness democracy in action.
We have a wonderful system in this country. The political science of the founding generation, the framers of our Constitution, Madison, Hamilton, Washington, Adams, that political science remains unsurpassed. We're not always true to our Constitution. Sometimes we've failed to live by it and to live up to it. But when we lived by it, and to the extent that we've lived up to it, ours has been a blessed country, a better country. A country that is worth fighting for, a country that's worth dying for. Ours is still the best regime.